read an ancient legend this week about two angels whose job it was to travel around the earth collecting up people's prayers into a basket. So each angel carried a basket, and wherever people prayed, they would go and place those prayers into a basket. Now, one of the angels' basket was a lot heavier than the other one. You can probably imagine or guess what basket was the heavy one. It was the basket full of people's requests. The other angel carried a basket that was for thanksgiving to God, and there wasn't much in that at all. And the angel with the heavy basket, he said, "Your basket appears to be a bit light on." And the angel with the light basket said, "Yeah, well, the thing is, people are very prepared to ask God for things, but when God grants their requests, they're less likely to say thank you." As I read that during the week, I thought, actually, that's pretty consistent with how I am. I'm pretty good at bringing my requests to God, but then I move on quite quickly, and I'm not so good at the thank you part. And really, our reading this morning from the Gospel of Luke is all about gratitude. It's a great story. Jesus is walking along, he's with his disciples, and then they see these 10 lepers. And as I was saying to the young people, back in those days, to have leprosy was about as bad as it got. Your life was broken almost in every sense. You suffered physically, you suffered socially because you were pushed away, you suffered spiritually because you weren't allowed to go to the temple, and you certainly suffered economically because you couldn't work. It was a really, really difficult life for people with leprosy. The first thing to notice, I think, from that story is the fact that unlike everyone else, Jesus goes towards the lepers. Everyone else runs away, probably quite understandably, to the point that they would have to ring a bell, the lepers, saying, "Unclean, unclean," to let people know they were coming so they could scramble and get out of the way. But Jesus doesn't run away from them. He goes towards them. He goes towards their pain, towards their brokenness. And really at the centre of Jesus' teaching is love, particularly for the marginalised. Jesus constantly taught that. And he didn't just say it, he actually walked the walk as well. So he goes towards these broken, marginalised people and he heals them, which is a beautiful part of the story. He heals them, but probably not in the way you might expect. He doesn't just touch them and they're healed straight away, which I'm sure they could have been. Jesus could have done that. But no, he sends them to the temple to show themselves to the priest. So back in those days, if you had leprosy, the way to be declared healed, to be declared clean, was to go to the temple, show yourself to the priest, and they would confirm whether or not the leprosy was gone and you were healed. So Jesus says to them, "Go and show yourselves to the priest." And interestingly enough, when he first sends them, the story doesn't tell us that Jesus heals them and then says, "Now go to the priest and show them." They want to be healed. Jesus says, "Go and show yourself to the priest." Why would he do it that way? Well, I think maybe part of it is it was probably requiring them to do something. Maybe it was a little bit of a test of faith. Was this just another in a long line of failed attempts at healing? Was this just another cruel act by someone towards them? Or were they going to trust this Jesus, that he had their best interests at heart? Were they going to trust that what he was telling them to do was ultimately going to be for the best, ultimately going to bring them life? So I think in some ways there's a lesson there as well. It's an act of faith required on their behalf as well, to do what Jesus tells them to do. And I'm not sure if it was faith or desperation on the men's behalf, but whatever it was, when you're sick, for those of you who have been seriously ill at any point in time, you'll know that you're pretty much prepared to do anything. So maybe it was desperation, but these 10 men, they begin the journey, walk to the temple to show themselves to the priest. And amazingly, as they go on their journey, as they walk in the direction Jesus tells them, they're healed. They're healed as they go. And their healing is complete. Make no mistake about that. It's not just a physical healing. That's the obvious part of it, but it's way more than that. They're physically healed, but they would be socially healed as well. They're now able to return to community. Economic healing, they can start working again. Spiritual healing, they can rejoin the temple and the worshipping community of that day. And I think that's significant as well, because we need to understand that Jesus' desire for us, for our world, for each person in it, is holistic. Not just concerned with our spiritual health, but concerned with the whole person. It's a good reminder of that as well. Jesus brings life and life to the full. It's holistic. So here they are, these healed lepers, celebrating possibly the greatest moment in their life, whooping it up with joy. And incredibly, only one of them goes back to thank Jesus. There's a beautiful picture on the front of the order of service. You'll see the guys in the background absolutely loving life and jumping around, healed. But they've kind of moved on and forgotten about Jesus, but one goes back. And the amazing thing about the one that goes back, the twist in the tale, if you like, is that he's actually a Samaritan. And Samaritans were not well regarded and not well liked, and they were regarded as being outside of God's purposes. But he's the one who goes back. And it's just so Jesus to use an outsider to, in a way, shame the insiders. Those who think they've got it all together, those who think that somehow in God's eyes they're better than others. Jesus so often used the outsider to shame those who considered themselves insiders. To remind them, in a sense, that maybe they're not as good as they think they are. And when this leper goes back to Jesus, Jesus says, "We're not all 10 cleansed. Where are the other 9? Rise and go, your faith has made you well." Rise and go, your faith has made you well. Well, hang on a minute, wasn't he already healed? You think it's interesting to say, it's like at that point Jesus says, yeah, you've said thanks, now you're completely healed. It's as though Jesus knew that those lepers, the other 9, were not completely healed until they learned to say thank you. Their bodies might be whole, but their hearts in some ways were still diseased. Until they learned the importance of thanking God, their healing would not be complete. I read a quote this week from Reverend Duncan, a guy I often read his reflections, and he was talking about this reading and the importance of saying thank you to God. And he said this, he said, no matter how stunning your physical appearance, no matter how impressive your intellectual credentials, no matter how complete your material success, you are still morally and spiritually inadequate if you have not learned to say thank you to the one who is the source of all you have and all you are. Gratitude is just so important. And I just want to outline 3 quick reasons why it's so important, and we pick those up from our text today. Firstly, I think that saying thank you is actually a statement of character. It's a statement, a reflection of humility. People who can't say thank you, and we've all met ungrateful people, but people who can't say thank you are not generally great people. It's one of the things we try to teach our kids, isn't it? To say thank you, to express gratitude, because we know it's good character. We know it's good for them and good for the people around them. A number of years ago, so my 2 older boys are 20 and 18, one of their friends who's similar age to them now, when he was 15, his name's Darcy, he did work experience. He loves music. And he went and did work experience with a luthier. So a luthier is someone who makes guitars, basically. And Darcy's a great kid, great character, shows his gratitude, very thankful. He did this week's work experience with this luthier. At the end of the week, when Darcy was saying thank you to him, the luthier said, I want you to have this. And he handed him a handmade acoustic bass, which was actually worth a lot of money. And he was kind of shocked, and he said, you're a good kid. I love how grateful you were to be here, and I love your attitude, and I want you to have this. And when I heard that, I immediately contrasted it. I used to work in a high school helping, one of the things we did was help place kids in work experience placements. And I would regularly get phone calls from bosses saying, I can't have this kid. Their attitude is terrible. They're just they think everything's owed to them. They don't say thank you for anything. I can't handle it, can't have it. And that was a poor reflection on the school, actually, because we felt bad about that, because it was a poor reflection on the character of those students. So saying thank you is a statement of character. It's a statement of humility. Second thing to say is that saying thank you is a statement of grace. It's a recognition that we don't deserve everything we have. It's hard for us to wrap our head around that, I think, in our society, but pride is possibly the greatest barrier that we have to saying thank you. Many of us don't like to acknowledge our dependence on anybody, not even God. We like to think that everything we have is because we've worked hard, because we're smart, because we're somehow maybe a little bit better than the people around us. We like to think that. Very often it's just not true. We like to think where we are, we've got there on our own steam and our own goodness and our own worthiness. But here's the thing. When we think we're better than we are, we actually minimise our need for God. When we think we're better than we are, we minimise our need for God. Another quote from Ken Duncan, he said, "I am convinced that this, a lack of gratitude, is the primary detriment to joy in the church today. How can we thank God for our deliverance from sin and death when we are convinced that we are already pretty good people who deserve everything God has given us? We don't see our sickness, so how can we thank our physician?" You all know the story of John Newton, who wrote the very famous hymn, Amazing Grace. He was a slave trader, and he actually felt terrible guilt for the suffering that people had experienced because of his being a slave trader. He carried terrible guilt until he encountered God's incredible forgiveness, God's amazing grace. And when he experienced that, that song just flowed out of what he was sensing, of what he knew he didn't deserve it. He knew the terrible things he'd done, and yet God extended that grace and forgiveness to him anyway, and then that flowed out of John Newton. Now, we're probably not as bad as John Newton. I don't think anyone here is into the slave trade. I hope not, but we're probably not that bad. But don't be deceived, because the reality is we've all missed the mark when it comes to living the way God created us to live. The Greek word for sin, hamartia, literally means to miss the mark. We've all missed the mark. None of us measures up when it comes to being the people God created us to be. It's bad for us. It's bad for the people around us. And so we need, all of us, need God's forgiveness, God's grace. And to experience that forgiveness and that grace is life-changing. Third brief thing to say, finally, is that saying thank you is a statement of worship. It's why we gather, partly why we gather on a Sunday morning, to say thank you to God for God's love, for pointing us in the direction of life. Notice that the lepers began to heal as they walked on their journey. And I think it's like that with us and God. As we go in the direction of following Jesus, as we move along that path, we begin to experience healing in our lives. We begin to become more like the people God created us to be. As I've said many times, that doesn't mean that this life is perfect, that everything goes well, that nothing ever goes wrong. But it means we're journeying with Jesus. We have help through those difficult times, but we're also heading towards that life, and that life in all its fullness, which we'll fully experience the other side of eternity. So we look forward to that, but we are healed as we go with Jesus. We need to be people of gratitude, grateful to God for all that he has done. A final quote here from Tom Wright, the New Testament theologian. He says, "It is not only the 9 ex-lepers who are shown up, it is all of us who fail to thank God always and for everything, as Paul puts it in Ephesians 5. We know with our heads, if we have any Christian faith at all, that our God is the giver of all things. Every mouthful of food we take, every breath of air we inhale, every note of music we hear, every smile on the face of a friend, a child, a spouse, all that, and a million things more, are good gifts from his generosity." Focusing on what we have and being grateful for the good things we have in our life is actually good for us. Scientific studies show that people who give thanks, people who are grateful for what they have a better level of health and well-being. It's good for us. Life is better when we're grateful. And it's significant that only the grateful leper right at the end, was said to have been made well. Another way of saying that, the Greek word there for well can also be translated as saved. We're being told in the text that it's only once we recognise what we owe Jesus and come and fall at his feet, that's when we'll be saved. That's when we'll find life and life to the full, beginning now and stretching into eternity. Just going to leave now a moment's silence for you to hear what God might be saying to you by God's Spirit from what you've heard, and then I'll pray. So just some quiet.